Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 5, we're asking how does tackling SDG 8.7 and the fight to end modern slavery by 2030 work with the UN's other Sustainable Development Goals to create a better and more sustainable world for us all? I'm Todd. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by University of Nottingham researcher Emily Wyman. Emily leads the Rights Lab's development of effective partnerships with government, local authorities, business and charities, all working to tackle modern slavery. I'm also pleased to welcome Jasmine O'Connor, who's the CEO of Anti-Slavery International, which works to eradicate slavery and its causes from the world. Thank you for joining us today. We're looking at the connections between SDG 8.7 and SDG 17, which looks to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. I'd like to start with Jasmine, if I may. You work for Anti-Slavery International, which is a non-governmental organization that has been in existence really from the 19th century, the early 19th century, and has worked on anti-slavery ever since. So I'm really interested in this idea of how do NGOs like Anti-Slavery International bring about effective change, just generally speaking. So it's advocacy campaigns, working through transnational advocacy networks, as they're called, lobbying governments, working with international governmental organizations. What's the sort of nuts and bolts of what you do and how you try to bring about positive change in this area?
Good question, and a complex question with probably a simple answer, because I think at its most simple level, it's listening to the people who are either experiencing slavery or who are at risk of slavery, and understanding the drivers, the causes, and beginning to plan with them and a multitude of other partners to address those root causes systemically in order to get change today that will be lasting tomorrow. And so a simple solution, but when you come down to it and what actually needs to be leveraged to deliver that solution, it starts to get multifaceted and quite complex.
So when you start talking to people and listening to their stories and you have this sort of orientation towards drivers and causes, what are the sort of common things that emerge, the themes that emerge from those conversations that you can say, you know, these are absolute systemic things that are happening that we as an organization can address?
Well, very often you're looking at groups that are discriminated against in society in one way or another. And I think that sort of othering can enable criminals who want to enslave to effectively prey on individuals while other parts of society maybe turn the other way. You're looking at people who are very often in poverty themselves or who are vulnerable to a whole range of shocks. And I think we only have to look at the global pandemic and how that is impacting scores of individuals around the world and pushing them in to a place where they are facing more shock, more vulnerability, and are at risk of being enslaved. And I think to say the most important piece for us is understanding the perspectives of survivors, because to really get under the skin of what's going on, you need to talk to people who have been tricked and trapped into slavery, because slavery just doesn't happen overnight. It's a systematic exploitation of individuals who are preyed upon by those who seek to exploit them. And very often a survivor may be in one context, a strong, empowered individual, but then perhaps they move, they seek to go overseas to find work, and are maybe trapped or tricked along the way by all sorts of promises to give them a better life, give them an amazing job, etc., etc. And tragically, they end up in a situation where they're being exploited and enslaved. So it's understanding the mechanisms that people who engage in slavery are using to trap and trick individuals into that specific form of exploitation.
And I think this focus on trapping and tricking is absolutely crucial, because there's a lot of popular discourse in public media, social media, etc., when they see the statistics and how this is affecting both the UK, but countries outside the UK and around the world, that somehow people have a choice. They made a choice; it was a bad choice, and that really lapses into this standard kind of blaming the victim culture. And what you're really telling us is that well-intentioned, well-abled people unwittingly make a choice that leads them into something that later on does become an exploitative situation, and that there are people who exploit conditions for people to make those decisions. So I'm very interested. You're one of the first guests on the Rise Track to actually talk about this tricking and trapping, and I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. So that's a decisive moment, but you're also highlighting that there are broader patterns that make that tricking and trapping more possible. So in addition to poverty and the othering and dehumanization, marginalizing discourses, et cetera, what are some of the other socioeconomic factors that you identify as being a problem for creating this enhanced vulnerability, if you will?
Well, I think in terms of the socioeconomic factors, they're many and varied, and each context has got to be understood in its own right. But I think there are some common themes across different sectors and different mechanisms of slavery. For example, we work a lot on supply chain slavery, and within that context, some of the ways that people are tricked and trapped might be around the rules of buying at a certain price that drives a factory that might be in a context where it's not being fully held to account or inspected by government. And we know that that can create situations where individuals are put into exploitation. Other forms of trickery, we can think quite clearly about children as an example here of a group that finds themselves being discriminated against in society, that is naturally a vulnerable category, and the ways in which that children might be tricked and trapped through online chat rooms into sexual exploitation, etc., etc. So these tricks and traps, I think, are all around us in the systems that we create economically, socially, and politically. And sometimes they're loopholes that traffickers will use. Sometimes they're designed to do good, but are turned into a form of trickery. And I think for us as an organization, the importance of partnership in actually understanding these systemic ways in which people are enslaved and trapped into slavery is of utmost importance, because we can't do it on our own. We have to work with employers, we have to work with educators, we have to leverage every single SDG, actually, because every single SDG has got something to say about the ways people are vulnerable, the context that they find themselves in, perhaps with governments that aren't having a kind of rules-based approach, and those elements of the international system that tricks and traps.
This is a brilliant segue for my last question for you at the moment, Jasmine, which is really about working with others. You talked about working with educators, working with governments, working with various agencies, etc. So, do you have in your working model, if you will, within ASI, a sort of engagement strategy? So, how do you engage with partners? Who do you seek out to affect change? And at what level? There's this whole literature on multi-level governance, for example, that you have this sort of international level of international governmental organizations. There's a transnational level of NGOs cooperating across the world, domestic governments, then there's local government, etc. So how does ASI engage in those different networks?
It depends what the networks are and what the drivers of slavery are in any given context. We will always partner with an organisation on the ground that is leading change in their own context, because we think that ultimately is the only way you'll get the sort of systemic change at a grassroots level, i.e. if those individuals are informing the solutions. And then we seek out the governments, the international organisations, the multilateral organisations that we need to engage to ensure that those changes happen. And I think in the sort of COVID context, it's interesting because, we did a very quick survey of organisations that we're in partnership with to find out what was happening around the world. 51% of those organisations said that they'd already seen evidence of an increase of slavery, trafficking, forced labour, and the worst forms of child labour being the examples that were most commonly cited. But actually 73% said their governments had not included or had scarcely included the needs and rights of people affected by slavery in the responses to the pandemic. And there you see an example of of things not working at their optimum. And so our role in that is to, here we go, we've got the data. Now, how are we using that data to advocate and to kind of leverage some better responses from governments, some better responses perhaps from some of our international partners in some of the UN agencies, to make sure that actually the COVID response takes into account the sorts of new vulnerabilities that are being created to slavery, and enables a response that actually seeks to try and mitigate those impacts and tries to make sure that more people don't fall into slavery. So I think that's just a very live example of how we're seeking to sort of use information and advocacy and leverage some of those partnerships to good effect.
Yeah, and we're already seeing, the sort of disproportionate effect of the pandemic on particular social groups, some of which have surfaced in reports, others that should have surfaced in reports, shall we say, and have not. So that vulnerability, that new vulnerabilities that you're talking about, are absolutely crucial to understanding what can be done today, now, to help these people. I want to bring in Emily Wyman here, who's interestingly was trained as an anthropologist, but also has worked on random controlled trial experiments in economics, and now works in the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Emily, from your perspective and the work that you have done and are currently engaged in, what's your view and your take on this sort of partnership working, the role of data? You may, of course, address the impact of the pandemic as well, but just curious about how, from a research organization perspective, do you plug into this huge network of advocates working to end the problem of modern slavery?
One of our big contributions as researchers, we hope, is to have the opportunity to sit back and really scan the collection of data that exists, the collection of learnings, the collection of evaluations that exists right across the sector. And part of our responsibility, I think, is to invest time and some resource in trying to understand what the impacts are of organizations just like anti-slavery and other organizations in this field, NGOs, businesses, governments, policymakers, what the outcomes of those interventions are at a kind of an overall or an aggregate level. So bringing together all of the work, or as much of the work as we can access, to start to ask questions about, at a national level, at a global level, where is there evidence of really strong intervention practices that are having an impact on the ground. Anti-slavery is a great example of an organization that puts a lot of information about the projects and the evaluation, so the outcomes of those projects, online, so that researchers like us can look through them and understand which aspects of the evaluations are really having the kind of highest impact. And indeed, some of the work that's been done by anti-slavery, so taking a very holistic approach to tackling different forms of slavery, has been really valuable in the learnings there. So I think this kind of overview analyses that researchers are able to bring to the table can become really valuable. And also in pinpointing areas where there are gaps, where we're just not quite sure what's working. The other thing I think that the research community can bring to the anti-slavery sector is some tools and some knowledge in how to produce really quality evaluations. So evaluations that really give us kind of strong foundations from which to say, yes, this aspect of the intervention seems to be working brilliantly, and these aspects of the intervention don't seem to be having as much impact. So starting a dialogue with NGOs about where resources are directed. So trying to feed intel back to NGOs about which aspects of those interventions appear to be strongest from an evaluation perspective. Those evaluations then continue to feed into the evidence base and start to give us a kind of really strong global picture of what's really working to tackle slavery. I really like the way that Jasmine mentioned listening to survivors, because how do researchers best listen to NGOs? Because it's of course not the case that researchers come to NGOs and policymakers with a toolkit that needs to be taught. We come to NGOs really wanting to understand, on the one hand, what's the knowledge base, this gigantic practice wisdom that exists within the NGO community. NGOs are in a fairly special position in that the frontline work that many of these organizations are engaged in means they have a very deep often quite a long-term understanding of what the key drivers are. And so we actually really enjoy a kind of bi-directional, kind of dialectic relationship with NGOs, where we try to listen very carefully to what it is that NGOs most need and what it is that they know, this kind of wealth of knowledge about key drivers and what the mechanics of slavery are on the ground. Researchers need to listen very carefully to what NGO needs are in order to be able to build strong relationships that ultimately work towards helping us towards our collective goal, which is to end slavery.
I think what's interesting about what you raised there is this need for systematic attempt at looking at all of these efforts in the round, and that research organizations, for lack of a better word, have a luxury of sitting back and looking at all that. But then you couple that with that need to contextualize the findings, and I think that's also very important. So that sort of overall project design is so important. So I know you work on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. What are the sort of key templates or typologies you've been working and developing around project design, so that when an NGO wants to go and do a new piece of work, have they got everything they need to know sort of ex ante before they get started?
We're kind of looking to identify a grander and aggregate global level which aspects of which interventions are having the kind of most impact in order to scale them quickly. Back in 2015, when Catherine Bryant and colleagues from the Walk Free Initiative did a kind of grand sweep of all the evaluations that were publicly available in order to construct the What Works database. Only 179 evaluations were available and of sufficient detail to be included in the database. So we're looking to improve this evidence base as quickly as possible. One of the areas that we feel that research can really contribute to that process is through the development of a kind of package of templates and tools to support civil society organizations, in particular around monitoring and evaluation practice. The hope that is this will directly support civil society organizations also to acquire and increase funding for frontline work. We're aiming to crystallize the basic principles behind things like theories of change, which are actually quite technical and complex to develop, so that civil society organizations can very easily work from their key goals to a series of clear articulated outcomes, and then develop indicators that enable those organizations to empirically assess the degree to which they've achieved those outcomes. We're developing an indicator bank that civil society organizations can refer to when they're looking to develop indicators for a program or a project. We're also pulling together a series of recommendations around how to conduct rights-based and trauma-informed monitoring evaluation. We're looking at participatory monitoring evaluation principles, so how survivor knowledge, expertise can be recruited once survivors have had sufficient trauma support. We're looking at technological solutions that will support civil society organizations in being able to conduct monitoring and evaluation in quite difficult circumstances out in the field. And the idea here is just that this package of support will kind of constitute a quick win for the movement. The quicker we can get that evidence base improved, the more easily we can monitor high impact and identify high impact interventions, the stronger the case that can be made for those to be scaled. The more quickly we can reach vulnerable communities for prevention and, of course, for support and rehabilitation purposes.
That's brilliant. I wonder if I just flip to Jasmine for one moment, and that is this question of theory of change. Does ASI have a theory of change, and does it use that theory of change in its program development?
We have a sort of global theory of change, which is very broad and actually really gets to this question of grassroots engagement and understanding being matched with the sort of international political will, and systemic solutions being the way to actually create change. And then in each individual project or on each individual theme, we actually develop a specific theory of change for those themes. So for example, our work in Niger, where we've been working with communities of slave descent, a part of that theory of change in breaking the cycle between slavery and freedom was actually focused on education. And the work that we embarked upon a number of years ago now was to empower people of slave descent to get their kids into school, to access education, as a way of breaking those slavery connections. And actually, it's an example of a really successful intervention in that it broke a long-standing bond between people of slave descent and their masters, and for the first time established their communities as free people. So I think, for me, that's one that works. They don't always work. And I think the really important thing to say on this podcast is that donors need to invest in trials, experimentation, to find out what works. Then when it works, they need to invest to enable these solutions to be scaled up. And the work that we've done in Niger, I'm pleased to say that it's been in partnership with the government there. The government is now seeking to scale some of this up so that more and more children and their families will be freed from slavery. So I think you can see, when I talk about the idea of a part of our kind of global theory of change being about engaging communities and engaging systems and government departments in creating the solution. I hope that gives you just a little bit of a flavour of what it looks like in action. And so the schools, really being a focal point for a whole range of other interventions in order to continue that process of freedom, from sort of microloans for families, human rights and advocacy training, building wells, enabling those communities not to fall into poverty, but to keep on that journey of development so that they don't become vulnerable once again to slavery. So yeah, I think that's just one example that I'd share, that the theory of change really was, if you educate kids and their families, there will be an empowerment and an understanding around their rights, and they will be in a position where they are able to leave their masters and embark upon their own sort of independent journeys of development, not in that shadow of slavery.
I really like this connection between education, empowerment, and breaking the bonds of slavery. I think that's a really, really neat way of thinking about how specific purposive action can bring about positive social change. So if I might come back to Emily now, we're going to talk a little bit about partnership building, relationship building. If you could say a bit more about the work you've been doing to foster those networks and to bring about positive collaboration between the research base, if you will, and those working on the front line and those working to change things at higher levels.
So this is really interesting. I came into the anti-slavery sector from academic research. And one thing that I noticed quite quickly is that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of networks, coalitions, groups, consortia all over the world. But one of the observations that I made quite quickly on entering this space was that there's a kind of lack of coordination across these various networks. And some of that will obviously have to do with the funding landscape, in that, relative to other areas of development, the funding pot for anti-slavery counter-trafficking activities is quite small. So there's competition for resources. But the observation that a lot of this has to do with historical reasons of the way that the anti-slavery movement evolved was quite interesting to me. So I've always been interested in exploring opportunities for cooperation and coordination, and we started to think about what some of the key areas might be for establishing cooperative networks. And given the work that I do at the Rights Lab, the obvious place to start here was around monitoring, evaluation and learning methods. So looking for ways to get organizations together to pool collective expertise and say, how can we improve the evidence base in anti-slavery? And this relates back to Jasmine's point about donors not being necessarily open to a culture of experimentation. So the evidence base at the moment is fairly weak, in that of at least 1,500 organizations on record as operating in English, when the Promising Practices database was constructed and searched in English for all the evaluations across the globe that could be included in the evaluation database. In 2015, only 179 evaluations popped up. So we're looking at ways to try and improve the quality of the evidence base as fast as we can. So methods for generating new evidence quickly. And we contacted a number of organisations, usually the monitoring, evaluation and learning practitioners within those organisations, to call a meeting to say, shall we get our heads together and see if we can produce a set of resources that would be a quick win for the movement, in that they would enable civil society organisations in particular to produce strong evaluations and thereby increase their funding, and simultaneously enrich the evidence base so we can start to get a more accurate grip on which areas of intervention are working most effectively in which sectors. And what was really interesting, to come back to the partnerships question, is there's huge will. There's huge interest in cooperation, but we're currently thinking that there's something about data and methods collaboration that seems to enable cooperation and working together perhaps slightly more easily than collaborations in other areas. We're not quite sure why that is at the moment. It may be that data and methods collaborations aren't subject to the same kinds of political constraints that other areas of collaboration might be. But we very quickly got a wide range of organisations expressing interest, and that's a project that's moving ahead quite quickly. There seems to be a lot of openness to that form of collaboration, and we're very optimistic about how that's going to develop over the near future.
I mean, I think this is a terrific point around the strength of data and methods as a common language, if you will, that is almost depoliticized. There's huge philosophical and epistemological debates around value-based research, and value-oriented research goes right back to many of the early thinkers about research methods, etc., through many social science disciplines for sure. But the primacy that you place on this as a mechanism that encourages collaboration is very heartening to hear. I guess just as a final question for both of you for this episode of The Rights Track, it's an unfair question, but it's one that I feel I must ask, and that is, the UK government just announced that it has plans to merge the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with the Department for International Development. And it's an open question to both of you. Is this a good or a bad thing for the fight against modern slavery? And I'll start with Jasmine and then finish with Emily.
I'd say the glass is either half full or half empty, depending on what day of the week I get up. I mean, it's interesting because, at Anti-Slavery International, we're an advocacy organisation. We work to change the system, and that means that actually we do need the full engagement of our sort of diplomacy in the fight against slavery, alongside the sort of aid budget that supports the delivery of many of these sustainable development goals. There are opportunities and threats whichever way you house the mechanisms of aid and the mechanisms of diplomacy in the UK government. But my concern would, of course, be that we wouldn't want to erode that 0.7 and let it sort of slip into funding the sort of core international policy objectives of the UK government, rather than the sort of focused poverty eradication and sustainable development objectives that we've signed up to as a member of the international community. So I remain sort of reasonably optimistic, because whatever the furniture in Whitehall is, we will be getting in there with our feet under the table and challenging diplomats and other government departments to do all they can to continue the fight against modern slavery that they've been leading in many respects.
That's a brilliant response. And, this commitment to 0.07 of gross domestic product for foreign assistance is not going to go away. And the Prime Minister confirmed that funding would still stay there. But there's this kind of melding, if you will, of the diplomatic and the developmental. And it's interesting because SDG 17 puts ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, front and center of its desire to bring about in partnership working for the future across all sorts of things like tech, finance, trade, and other high-level commitments. So, Emily, in your work, where do you see any of that merging affecting what you're going to be doing in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as well as partnership building?
I wish I was as optimistic that it might turn out okay. I recognise, of course, the Prime Minister's statement that the percentage contribution won't be reduced. I think that it makes a big difference when you, as an organisation, are engaged in advocacy, because that really keeps you on track with the fight. But my gut instinct is that the budget will in the long term be threatened. I kind of go by this philosophy that you're only as healthy as your community is, and I worry about the implications of a reduced budget, the international, referring there to the international community. Unless we are involved in aid and development and funding aid and development in areas where it's really needed, I feel that the well-being of the international community is under threat. Being involved actively in advocacy is really the right way to go, because it keeps you optimistic and it puts you in a position to be able to hold governments to account. Thank goodness for those advocacy-oriented organisations.
I think that's absolutely critical. We've covered tremendous ground on this episode. We've talked about vulnerabilities and new vulnerabilities, drivers, long-term systemic drivers, but also theories of change and how to disrupt those drivers. We've talked about the new vulnerabilities and how they relate to the current pandemic, and how vulnerable communities have perhaps become even more vulnerable under conditions of the health threat of COVID-19. But also we've talked about the real challenge of fomenting change and collective action, as well as bringing in as many actors as possible with the best evidence possible to bring about this change. So for this episode of The Rights Track, could I just thank both Emily and Jasmine for incredibly useful insights, linking evidence to policy making, to change, to collaboration, and to making the world a better place. So for me, from The Rights Track, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd and produced by Chris Gerrington of Research Podcasts. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery. Don't forget to join us on Twitter @RightsTrack and to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts.